There's a very excellent book come out called Chronicle of the World, and it has the entire history of the world in very graphic form. Well, I couldn't wait to see what they said about Jesus here. And I found one tiny little note under 9 BC. A Jewish couple, Joseph the carpenter and his wife Mary, have a baby in a stable in Bethlehem and name him Jesus. I thought, well, that's not all they can say about him. What else do they say? And then I read this: Jewish preacher works miracles, but the word miracles is in quotation marks, and under it says that two things make Jesus more than just one more itinerant preacher. One is the intense popular appeal of his teaching, and the other is his performance of alleged miracles. Jesus has supposedly raised the dead, turned the water into wine, cured fatal illnesses, and exhibited other supernatural powers. Then there's a whole column about his death, and then one more mention of Mark writing the story of Jesus, and the final section details the alleged resurrection after death. And that's the lot. And I thought that's all they can say about Jesus. And I was very disappointed, almost dismissing him as just another person in history. And then I just felt the Lord say to me, but look at the top of the page. And at the top of every page, it says 1294, 1155, 420, 45, and then it says 160 BC, 370 BC, and I realized he's mentioned on every page of the history of the world. You see, we're asking what makes Jesus unique. Why did he split history in two? Of course, bear in mind that in many parts of the world, the date is not 1990. It is not that date in China or in Saudi Arabia. It is the date in Western society and the parts of the world that have been influenced by Western society. But he is the man who split history in two for us. So what makes him unique? All great lives, as I said, begin with birth and end with death. And in between, we can look at what a man says and what he does and what he is. But if that's all we have of Jesus, then we are left with the question mark. Who was he? Nobody really knows. Was he just a human being? Was he an extraordinary human being? Was he a unique human being? Was he more than a human being? We would not know unless there was more to say about Jesus than I've already told you. And there is a great deal more. When he died, God did nothing to vindicate him. And therefore it looked as if he had been an impostor. And yet the disciples who'd known him couldn't accept that he was a deceiver. They couldn't accept that he was mad. They thought he was the Christ, the Son of the living God, but now it looked as if they were wrong, and there was no other explanation available. And if that was the end of the story, then we would not know. But I want to point out that Jesus had predicted his death, even the time of it, and the manner of it. He said, I'm not going to be stoned or thrown off a cliff. I'm going to be crucified. And we're going up to Jerusalem. He decided to die. He said, no man takes my life from me. I lay it down of myself, and I will pick it up again. He not only predicted his death, he arranged it. And the more you read the story, he was not a helpless victim. He arranged his own death. And furthermore, he explained it to them. He said it was a ransom for many. Now, a ransom is the price that needs to be paid to set people free from kidnappers. And he explained his death as the price that was needed to set people free from a kidnapper. That was how he explained it. So he apparently knew what was going to happen and deliberately chose death. However, the Old Testament, which had also predicted his death in the law, in the prophets, and in the writings, also made another prediction. Now, the body I'm using to speak to you now is a body that will one day rot and will very quickly, within a matter of 3 or 4 days, become a stinking, rotten mess that you would not like to look at or touch or smell. It is one of the most humiliating facts of human existence that we rot in the grave. And the reason why our bodies go rotten, according to the Bible, is that our spirits are rotten. And our bodies reflect the state of our souls. And therefore the Bible makes this statement, that if ever a perfect life was lived on earth, God would not leave the corpse in the grave, because a holy one would not be allowed to see corruption. You'll find it in Psalm 16, which means that if ever a really holy person lived a whole life on earth without ever once sinning, that God would not leave the body in the grave until the 4th day, because it's the 4th day that decay sets in. And Jesus died predicting that God would have his body out of the grave on the 3rd day. But the disciples had never quite got the message, so that when the death happened, they were absolutely shattered and could no longer believe that Jesus was the Son of the living God. However, the fact is that on that 3rd day, the grave was empty. Many people have tried to explain that. They've explained that Jesus simply fainted on the cross and swooned. They've explained that the disciples stole the body. They've explained it by saying that Mary came to the wrong tomb. They've tried every explanation they can, but none of them will hold. Those who've really examined the evidence are convinced of the historical fact. There was a young man called Frank Morrison, a legal scholar, who studied the evidence and finally was convinced that Jesus must be alive, simply by the evidence he examined. And he wrote a book called Who Moved the Stone? 2 Oxford professors, one summer vacation, decided to spend the vacation proving that there was not sufficient evidence for the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. When they met again at the beginning of the October term in Oxford, one of the professors said to the other, "I'm very embarrassed to tell you that during the summer vacation, my examination of the evidence has convinced me that Jesus rose from the dead. So we can no longer write that book together." And the other professor said, "You don't know how relieved I am to hear you say that. We can write the book together." And the 2 professors wrote the book, proving the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. There is 1,000 times more evidence for Jesus' resurrection from the dead than for Julius Caesar's invasion of England. Was that in 44 BC or somewhere around there? And yet people happily believe in Julius Caesar invading England, but they don't happily believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Why not? There's a very simple reason. If I believe that Julius Caesar invaded England in 44 BC, I can go on living the same way I was living before. And it doesn't change anything. But if I believe that Jesus rose from the dead, then everything changes, and my life can never be the same again. And I've discovered people believe what they want to believe, that it's not a matter of evidence but of choice. And if people don't want to believe a thing, they won't, even if you give them all the evidence. Now, when we say Jesus rose from the dead, what exactly do we mean? It's important that we understand what we mean. We do not mean that he became conscious and active again. Yet that seems to be how most people think. Jesus was fully conscious and fully active between his death and resurrection. But you never hear about that. Do you know why? Because most Holy Week services finish on Friday and start up again on Sunday morning. So nobody ever tells you what he did on Saturday. Have you ever noticed that? But the Bible does. Peter tells us what Jesus was doing between his death and resurrection. And he must have found out when he met the risen Lord on the first Easter Sunday. We don't know where they met or anything that was said. And I'm going to speculate now, but I think I'm near the truth. Jesus met Peter, and Peter said, "Jesus, where on earth have you been?" And Jesus said, "I've not been on earth. I've been in Hades, the world of the dead." And Peter said, "Well, what on earth have you been, what in Hades have you been doing?" And Jesus said, "I've been preaching." And Peter said, "Preaching? Who to?" "I've been preaching to all those who were drowned in the days of Noah's flood." Now, what an extraordinary tidbit of information. And you'll find it in chapter 3 of Peter's epistle in your New Testament. So Jesus was fully active, conscious, and communicating with others between his death and resurrection. The resurrection was not him becoming active and conscious again, but him becoming conscious and active in this world again. That's the first thing we need to clear up. The second thing we need to clear up is this: Jesus' resurrection was not a resuscitation. Now, many people are resuscitated from death. A drowning person or a drowned person can be brought back to life with the kiss of life. You pump their lungs and you put your mouth on their mouth and hold their nose and blow, and they are resuscitated. Or a person on an operating theatre table can be clinically dead with a stopped heart and can be brought back by pounding the chest or pumping calcium into the heart muscle or putting electrodes on the chest and giving them a shock. And they are resuscitated. It happens frequently. But Jesus was not resuscitated. The widow of Nain's son was resuscitated. Jairus' daughter was resuscitated. Lazarus was resuscitated, but Jesus was not. What do I mean? I mean that in all those other cases, including the cases today, people come back into their old body to die again. Lazarus died again. The widow of Nain's son died again. They were resuscitated and got their old body going again. Jesus was not resuscitated. The body he went into the tomb with was not the body he came out with. If it had been, the grave clothes would have had to be unwrapped. And they were not unwrapped. And that's why John, when he saw the grave clothes, believed, because he knew that no man had touched that body. The grave clothes, which had been wrapped around the body, were lying flat and empty. The old body had totally disappeared. The body that Jesus came out of the tomb with was a brand new body. It still had the same features, including the nail prints, but it was a new body which has never died again and which has got no older. Do you honestly think Jesus is a decrepit old age pensioner now? Of course you don't. But if you think through the implications, you'll realize what I'm trying to say. Let me bring it home to you by asking you a question. Where do you think Jesus got his resurrection clothes from? You've never thought about it, most of you. Did you think he was walking around stark naked? He left all his grave clothes in the grave. So where did he get his new clothes from? Did somebody take pity on him and give him some second-hand clothes? Or did he wait for Marks and Spencer's to open and go to St. Michael? No. The same God who made a new body for him made new clothes for him. In other words, what I'm saying is this. In the resurrection of Jesus, something happened that only a creator God could have done. A resuscitation could have been done humanly, but a new body that would never grow old and die again, that can only be done by a creator God who can make something out of nothing. Do you follow me? Therefore, the resurrection of Jesus was something that only God could have done. And the significance of it blows your mind. Do you realize why it happened on a Sunday? Because Sunday is the 8th day of the week. Now, what is the significance of that? Well, God the Creator made the universe in 6 days. We don't know how long those days were. The 7th day certainly was not 24 hours, but lasted for centuries. So the other days we're not bound by Scripture to believe there were 24 hours. But he made the world in 6 days, 6 days to him, and then he rested on the 7th day. How long did the 7th day last? It lasted all through the Old Testament. God created nothing new in the whole Old Testament period. Indeed, the Old Testament says itself in Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. So for the whole of the Old Testament period, God is resting. Now, he is creating again, and the first part of the old creation to be made new is Jesus' body. This is the 8th day, which is the first day of the 2nd week of creation. That's why we worship on a Sunday. Has nothing to do with the day of rest. That's Saturday. Sunday we celebrate that God has gone back to work, that he's creating things new again. That's why he poured out the Spirit on Pentecost, which was a Sunday. It's why he's making new creatures more on Sunday than any other day of the week. If you're a Christian, Sunday will be your busiest day, not a rest day. Right? Because God's back at work. He's making all things new, and he's begun with Jesus' body. I mustn't get sidetracked on this, but the difference between the old creation and the new is this. In the old creation, he made the heavens and the earth first, and human beings last. But in the new creation, he's making human beings first and the new heaven and the new earth last. Because he wants to take the people out of the old creation and get them ready for the new one. And he wants to give you a new nature, a new body, and one day a new heaven and a new earth. And the whole universe will be yours to travel in without spacesuits. I'm getting too excited. It all comes out of that empty tomb. God was in that tomb creating. And that was God's answer to the trial of Jesus and to the death of Jesus. He let him die. And then he said, now I'll show you he is my son. And it was the resurrection that began his life after death that really tells us who Jesus was. He is unique. Nobody else has ever had that happen to them. There have been resuscitations, but there has never been a creation of a new body for anyone. There will be, but there hasn't been yet. Jesus is the only person to whom this happened. And when he came back to the disciples, they could hardly believe for joy. But they knew instantly he wasn't mad, he wasn't bad, he was God. And they were absolutely sure now, because God had done something for this man that he'd done for no one else. Now, Thomas was not there on the first Sunday. He was mooning about the streets in deep depression all by himself. And so when he came back to the upper room later that night, they said, Jesus is alive, he's been here. Look, there's his plate. We were having fish and chips, and he sat down and he had some, and there are the bones. And Thomas looked at the fish bones. He said, you're not going to kid me. He said, I'm sorry, I'd love to believe it. But he said, you're all in an excitable condition. He said, unless I can push my finger through the hole in his hand and push my hand in that cut in his side, I'm sorry, I won't believe. 1 week later, they're in the same room, 11 of them, Thomas with them this time. Judas, of course, had committed suicide. Doors are bolted, and a voice just behind Thomas's shoulder said, Thomas, come and put your finger through my hand. And he never did. Do you know why? His brain was in a whirl. His brain said, how does he know what I said? He wasn't in the room last Sunday. How does he know what I said? And his little brain said, there's only one person who can know everything you say, who's invisibly present. And Thomas, bless him, was the first person ever to say of Jesus the one word by itself, God. My Lord and my God. Even Peter hadn't managed that. Peter had managed the Son of the living God, but Thomas was the first ever to use the unqualified word God about a carpenter from Nazareth. And that's what convinced them. For the next 6 weeks, Jesus appeared and disappeared until they realized that actually when they couldn't see him, he was still around. He was weaning them off their senses so that he could then say the most extraordinary thing to them. 6 weeks later, he said, right, I'm off. I'm going back home to my dad. Don't worry, I'll be with you always. Now, what a crazy thing for a person to say. Goodbye, I'm off home. Don't worry, I'm not going. I'll be with you to the end of the world. And the amazing thing is that when they finally waved goodbye to him, they were thrilled to bits. Now, 6 weeks earlier, they'd been broken-hearted when they thought they'd seen the last of him. Now they're filled with joy. And he just went straight up into heaven, the first man to go into space. Nobody else has been into space. Don't believe all these newspaper stories that men have been into space. No one has been into space except Jesus and Elijah and Enoch. See, all the men you've read about who've claimed to go out in space, they didn't go out in space. They went in a spacesuit, which kept the Earth's atmosphere inside it. So they haven't been into space. An American astronaut was asked when he got back, did you meet God up there? He said, no, but if I'd taken my spacesuit off, I might have done. Which was pretty near the truth. Nobody's been into space, but Jesus just stepped back up into heaven as easy as I talk to you. Why were they so thrilled? Because he said, don't worry, I'm coming back. Now there's a claim, if you like. What other great figure has dared to say, I'll be back? And I'm coming back the same way as I went. But you know why they were really thrilled? Because knowing who he was, that's where he belonged. That's where he was needed. Because they knew that everything he said was true. And when he said, all authority in heaven and on earth is now given to me, he's saying, I'm going to run the universe from now on. There's a human being running the universe. Did you know that? His name is Jesus, and he's the King of England, and I'm his representative here. I went to Romania. They've still got a king in Romania, and he's Jewish. Did you know that? Went to China. China has a king, and he's a Jew. Went to Australia. They've got a Jewish king. Would you believe it? And his name is the same every time. His name is Jesus. Do Do you realize what a difference that makes to you when you read about the invasion of Kuwait? Jesus is still in charge. The world's not out of his control. All authority in heaven and on earth is given to him. And to know that our friend, the carpenter of Nazareth, is now running the universe. Boy, that's something. That's exciting. Do you really believe it? The disciples did. See, when he went to heaven, they realized that now they could pray to him up there. And he'd promised that if 2 or 3 of them agreed on anything on earth, he would just whisper in his dad's ear and the prayer would get answered. He said, you can now pray to my Father and use my name. Just tell my Father you know me when you pray. Boy, that's powerful, isn't it? He's running the universe. People have been saying, have you been on holiday, David? You're looking sunburned. No, that's the result of a miracle. 1 week ago, I was up in Northumberland. A little bunch of people had a vision of a field on the top of the moors of Northumberland filled with people listening to the gospel. Somebody else had another vision, and I was the preacher. So they wrote to me and said, we know the date's free because the Lord has given us the vision. My date was free, so I went up. And I began the afternoon by saying, you were wise to come here because though the weather forecast says a belt of sharp rain is going to cross Northumberland in the middle of the afternoon, you've come to the one part of Northumberland that won't get rain. Mind you, it stretched my faith. Because 10 minutes before I was due to speak last week, the sky went black from horizon to horizon, and the rain belt came from the southwest straight for us. And we were up near Otterburn on the top of the moors. Couldn't see another house in sight, miles from anywhere. And I'd said, no wet weather program. If God is in this, he's in charge of that too. And though they'd bought me sou'westers and wellies and cloth cap, I put them all in the boot of the car. I said, I'm not touching them. But the rain came nearer and nearer. And I was sitting on the back of an articulated lorry, and I looked up and I said, Lord, please, you did this, so split that cloud. Split it. And it opened up in the middle. I said, wider, Lord, wider. And I watched it go wider. And when I got up to speak last Saturday afternoon, I was in sunshine for the next 3 hours. And we watched the rain go down the valley, that side of the hill, and down the valley, that side of the hill. So that's why I'm sunburned. It's just preaching under the heavens where the Lord Jesus controls the universe. That's why we're glad he's gone. I'm glad we can't keep him here. It's better for us that he's up there. It really is. Because if Jesus was still on earth, how often do you think you'd get him to Ashford? Once in a blue moon, maybe. But now that he's sent his Spirit to take his place, how often can you have his Spirit in Ashford? Every day. It's better for you, he said. So they were thrilled when he went. But he's promised to come back. Now, that has tremendous implications. Not only has he gone up there to pray for us, to run the universe for us, he is now in overall authority. When Queen Elizabeth II was crowned in Westminster Abbey, the Archbishop put the crown on her and said these words, wear it until he comes to whom it belongs. See, our Queen wears someone else's jewelry. Belongs to Jesus. He's coming back to take over the governments of the world. He's going to show us how to run the world. There's a promise that he will bring justice and peace, that nations will not learn war anymore, that they're going to beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. When he comes back, we try to do it without him. We can't, but he's going to do it. Here's one of the most serious things. We now know that when he said, I will judge the human race, that was the truth. God will not judge us. Indeed, some have thought it would be unfair if God judged us. We could say to God, God, you don't know what it's like to be a human being. You don't know what it's like to be tempted. You don't know what it's like to be born illegitimate. You don't know what it's like to be falsely accused of a crime you never committed. You don't know what it's like to be hungry and thirsty, so hungry you'd steal for it. You don't know what it's like. But when, on the day of judgment, people see that it's Jesus on the throne of judgment, they won't say that. Because he does know what it's like. He's been here. And do you realize that on that day, all the great figures of the world will stand before Jesus to give their account to him? It's so easy to go to church and recite the creed and say, from thence he shall come again to judge the quick and the dead. But think the implications through. Margaret Thatcher will stand before Jesus to be judged. So will Neil Kinnock. So will Gorbachev. So will Bush. So will Saddam Hussein. They will all stand before Jesus. Do you realize that Muhammad himself will stand before Jesus to be judged? And Buddha will stand before Jesus to be judged. And Confucius will stand before Jesus to be judged. That's what he said he would come back to do, to decide the eternal future of every single human being. And you will stand before Jesus to be judged. This is part of the whole truth about Jesus. This is the part that comparative religion doesn't want to hear. You listening? That every other human being will be judged by Jesus himself. That's what he said. All the nations will stand before me, and I will separate them as a shepherd separates sheep from goats. I'll make the big decision. Furthermore, it means that Jesus will bring the world to an end. I was in a college not far from here, and there was a big computer, and a student was working at it, and I said, what are you working out? He said, I'm working out the date of the end of the world. I said, how do you work that out? He said, you feed in the population figures, the fuel reserves, the deforestation. You feed in all these factors, and you ask, when does the omega point come? When we can't go on supporting life on planet Earth. And I said, have you got to a date yet? He said, 2050. I said, that's exactly the same date as an American computer arrived at in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is one of the top technological institutes over the Atlantic. And they came up with the date 2050, that unless we can somehow stop the population growth or discover new sources of energy or do this or that, 2050, that's all we've got. Another 60 years. Then the world's going to come to an end. We live down the road from Greenham Common, and there are ladies living there under polythene sheets. They've been there for years now. They are scared stiff that somebody's going to press the wrong button and bring a nuclear holocaust that will end history. I don't want to ridicule anybody, but listen, I'm not panicking about nuclear holocaust or about the environment, because no man can put his finger on the button to bring the end of the world. There's a finger already on the button, and the finger is that of Jesus, the carpenter from Nazareth. Or in biblical terms, he alone is worthy to break the seals of the scroll on which God has already written the wind down of history. It includes the pollution of the oceans. It includes the death of a third of the human race through an uncontrollable disease. It includes many other features. They're all there in God's book. And Jesus is the one that will break the scrolls and start the countdown of world history. Do you really believe that? Because if you do, it'll cure a lot of your fears. Jesus is in control of history. The same one who rose from the dead and ascended to heaven is the one who will come back to wind it all up and to judge the entire human race. That's the story of his life after death. And the beautiful news is that he will inaugurate the new age. You'll hear many false Christs and false messiahs talking about the new age. There's only one new age, the age to come. And it is Jesus, the carpenter from Nazareth, who will inaugurate that new age. Because he's the Omega. He's the last point. He's the one who will consummate it all. It is God's purpose and intention to sum up all things in Christ. Not in any religion, but in Christ. Do you know that Jesus has 250 names and titles? It's a very good devotional exercise to find them all. I find that most Christians get stuck around 35. But he has 250 names and titles. The Muslims boast that Allah has 90 names, but Jesus has 250. Nobody else in history has ever had so many names and titles, because no one else has ever deserved them. And one of them is, he is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I've spoken to you in this talk about his life after his death, and it goes on right to the end of history and beyond the end of history as we know it, right into a new heaven and a new earth. And he's still there because he's the I am. He's the always. He's God. In the next talk, I'm going to talk about an even more surprising fact of his life before his birth. Because if you want to hear the whole truth about Jesus' life, you've got to begin way, way back there, long before he was born. And you've got to finish way, way back ahead there, long after he was dead. Because his life is as long as the universe. And that's the truth. That's why he's the way and the life. We'll leave it there.